The heavy steel door of the Rechlin test facility swung open on a cold morning in October 1942, and Oberst Friedrich Lang felt his confidence drain away as he watched technicians wheel in the captured American machine gun. It wasn't supposed to look like this. German intelligence had assured them that American weapons were crude, mass-produced junk that would crumble under proper scientific examination. But the Browning M250 caliber machine gun sitting on the test bench gleamed with a precision that made Lang's mouth go dry. Every surface was machined to tolerances he had only seen in Swiss watchmaking. The feeding mechanism moved with the smoothness of a perfectly balanced engine. This wasn't junk. This was a masterpiece of industrial engineering, and Lang knew with sudden certainty that everything they had been told about American manufacturing capability was catastrophically wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The captured weapon had been recovered from a B-17 Flying Fortress that crash-landed near Bremen 3 weeks earlier. The bomber had been hit by flak during a raid on the submarine pens, and though most of the crew had perished, the aircraft remained relatively intact. German salvage teams had carefully removed all 10 of the 50 caliber Browning machine guns, along with their ammunition, maintenance manuals, and spare parts. Now, at the Reich Air Ministry's primary weapons testing facility at Rechlin, Germany's top ballistics experts would finally have the opportunity to examine the weapon system that was causing such havoc among Luftwaffe fighter formations. What they discovered would lead to one of the most significant tactical warnings ever issued in the history of aerial warfare, a directive so urgent that it would be radioed directly to fighter units in the middle of combat operations. Do not engage flying fortresses head-on, under any circumstances. The men standing in the Rechlin testing hall that October morning represented the cream of German military engineering. Oberst Lang had designed improvements to the MG-151 cannon that equipped most German fighters. Major Heinrich Vollmer had developed revolutionary ammunition feeding systems. Dr. Werner Brandt held 2 doctorates in materials science and had consulted on every German aircraft weapon system since 1935. They had examined captured British, Soviet, and French weapons. They had analyzed battlefield performance data. They considered themselves experts in aerial armament. None of that prepared them for what they were about to learn. The Browning M2 had been designed by John Moses Browning in 1918, refined throughout the 1920s and 30s, and by 1942 had evolved into perhaps the most effective aircraft weapon ever created. The American designation was simple: caliber .50, Browning machine gun, heavy barrel, M2, aircraft. But that dry technical nomenclature concealed a weapon system that would revolutionize air combat. Major Vollmer approached the gun first, his engineer's eye immediately catching details that shouldn't exist on a mass-produced weapon. The barrel was chrome-lined for extended life. The bolt face showed precision grinding marks. The recoil spring housing was machined from a single billet of steel rather than assembled from stamped parts. He pulled the charging handle, feeling the smooth resistance of perfectly fitted components. In German aircraft weapons, there was always a slight catch, a tiny imperfection that required the armourer's skill to manage. The Browning had none. It was perfect. He looked at Lang and said quietly, "They are making these on production lines? Thousands of them?" Lang nodded, unable to speak. The implications were staggering. German aircraft weapons were crafted by skilled workers who might produce 3 or 4 guns per day. If the Americans could maintain this level of precision while mass-producing weapons, it meant their industrial capacity was orders of magnitude beyond what German intelligence had estimated. It meant that every calculation, every production schedule, every strategic timeline was built on a foundation of catastrophically wrong assumptions. Dr. Brandt began examining the ammunition, and here the German confidence suffered another devastating blow. The .50 caliber round was enormous compared to the rifle caliber rounds used in most German aircraft machine guns. Each cartridge was 3 times the weight, carried 4 times the powder charge, and delivered kinetic energy that German ballistics experts had calculated was impossible to achieve with aircraft-mounted weapons. The standard German fighter, The Messerschmitt Bf-109 carried two cowl-mounted MG-131 machine guns firing 13mm rounds, roughly equivalent to .50 caliber, but with significantly less powder and velocity. Most German fighters also carried two wing-mounted MG-151 over 20mm cannons. Excellent weapons, but with slow rates of fire and limited ammunition. The Americans had taken a different approach, concentrating entirely on the .50 caliber Browning and installing them in overwhelming numbers. The B-17 Flying Fortress carried 10 of them. Later models would carry 13. Each gun could fire at over 700 rounds per minute, though actual sustained rate was closer to 500 to avoid overheating. Each gun carried approximately 500 rounds, though tail and waist positions often had more. "Do the mathematics," Brandt said to the assembled engineers. "A single B-17 can put 5,000 rounds per minute into the air. A combat box formation of 18 bombers can deliver 90,000 rounds per minute. That's 1,500 rounds every second." He paused, letting the numbers sink in. No fighter formation can survive flying through that volume of fire, not if they attack from positions where multiple bombers can concentrate their fire. The testing began with standard ballistics evaluation. German 7.92mm rounds were fired into armor plate, then 13mm, then 20mm, and finally the American .50 caliber. The results were documented with high-speed cameras and precision instruments. Against standard Luftwaffe fighter armor, the .50 caliber rounds didn't just penetrate, they demolished. The kinetic energy transfer was so massive that armor plate cracked even when the round didn't penetrate cleanly. Engine blocks shattered, fuel tanks exploded rather than simply leaking, structural members failed catastrophically rather than deforming. Lang watched the slow-motion footage of a .50 caliber round hitting a section of Bf-109 fuselage taken from a crashed aircraft. The round entered through the thin aluminum skin, passed through internal structure, exited through the opposite side, and kept going with enough energy remaining to penetrate a second armor plate positioned behind the aircraft section. The test dummy positioned in the cockpit area was struck by fragments traveling at supersonic speeds. The damage was catastrophic and unsurvivable. "Now imagine," Dr. Brandt said quietly. "Imagine a fighter pilot pointing his aircraft directly at a flying fortress and flying straight toward it. He would be closing at perhaps 300 miles per hour. The bomber's nose guns, chin turret, and potentially top turret would all have clear shots. Multiple guns, perhaps 4 or 5, all firing .50 caliber rounds. The fighter would be flying directly into a stream of bullets traveling at 2,800 feet per second. The closure rate would be so high that even a brief firing pass would expose the fighter to dozens, perhaps hundreds of rounds. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. Major Vollmer did the calculations on a chalkboard, walking through the geometry of a head-on attack. A fighter approaching from 12 o'clock level, directly ahead of the bomber, would present a closing speed of approximately 450 miles per hour combined. At that speed, the fighter would close 1,000 yards, the effective range of the .50 caliber Browning, in approximately 4.5 seconds. In that time, a B-17 with 4 forward-firing guns could fire approximately 150 rounds from each gun, 600 rounds total. The fighter, a Bf-109, would be flying directly toward that stream of fire, with a frontal cross-section of approximately 75 square feet. The probability of multiple hits was not just high, it was mathematically certain. But even more devastating was the realization of what those hits would do. German fighters were designed for maneuverability and climb rate, which meant light construction. The engine, fuel tanks, pilot, and critical flight controls were all located along the longitudinal axis of the aircraft, directly in line with rounds coming from dead ahead. There was no armor configuration that could protect against multiple .50 caliber hits from this angle. Even a single round through the engine block would likely cause immediate catastrophic failure. A hit in the cockpit area was unsurvivable. A hit in the fuel tank system, even with self-sealing tanks, would likely cause fire. The test team constructed a full-scale mock-up showing the frontal aspect of a Bf-109, complete with internal components positioned accurately. They then conducted a firing test, having the Browning fire a short burst, just 20 rounds, at the mock-up from 1,000 yards. The results were filmed and documented. Of the 20 rounds fired, 6 struck the target area. 3 passed through the engine block area. 1 struck the cockpit region, and 2 hit wing root structures. The test team concluded that the mock-up aircraft, had it been real, would have been completely destroyed. The pilot would have been killed. The engine would have failed immediately. The structural damage would have made the aircraft uncontrollable, and this was from a single gun firing a brief burst. Now multiply that by 4 or 5 guns, all firing simultaneously. Oberst Lang stood in the testing hall after the firing demonstration, surrounded by data sheets, high-speed photographs, and the destroyed mock-up. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear but from the terrible weight of understanding. German fighter tactics, since the beginning of the daylight bombing campaign, had emphasized head-on attacks precisely because they offered the shortest exposure time to bomber, defensive fire. Pilots had been trained to point their fighters directly at the bomber's nose, fire their weapons, and flash past in a fraction of a second. The speed of the pass meant that bomber gunners had almost no time to track and engage, or so the tactics manuals claimed. Now, Lang understood that this approach, which had seemed so logical in the briefing rooms, was actually a death sentence. Every fighter pilot executing a head-on pass was flying directly into a focused stream of devastating fire. The brief exposure time that was supposed to protect them meant nothing when hundreds of 50 caliber rounds were filling the exact space they were flying through. The reason so many experienced pilots had been lost suddenly made terrible sense. They weren't being outfought. They were being mathematically eliminated by a weapon system far more effective than anyone had understood. The test report that Lang would eventually submit ran to 63 pages of technical analysis, ballistics data, and tactical recommendations, but the conclusion could be summarized in a single sentence that would be radioed to every fighter unit engaged with American heavy bombers. Under no circumstances are head-on attacks against B-17 or B-24 formations to be executed. Probability of fighter loss approaches certainty. Alternative attack angles must be employed exclusively, but before that warning could be issued, Lang needed to understand not just what the Browning could do, but why it was so effective. The answer lay in details that German engineers had overlooked, details that revealed uncomfortable truths about American industrial and engineering philosophy. The Browning's effectiveness began with its action, a short recoil system where the barrel and bolt remained locked together for a brief moment after firing. This allowed chamber pressure to drop to safe levels before the action opened, which permitted the use of higher pressure ammunition without risking case rupture or action damage. German aircraft machine guns mostly used blowback or gas-operated actions that couldn't safely handle such high pressures. The ammunition itself was revolutionary. The standard American 50 caliber round used in aircraft applications was the M2 ball, armor-piercing, or the M1 incendiary. The armor-piercing round featured a hardened steel core that would punch through armor plate, continue through internal structure, and often exit the far side of an aircraft with energy to spare. The incendiary round contained a small explosive charge that would detonate on impact, starting fires in fuel tanks, hydraulic lines, and oxygen systems. German intelligence had assumed these were specialized rounds produced in limited quantities. The testing at Rechlin revealed that these were standard production ammunition, manufactured in quantities that seemed impossible. Every 6th round was typically a tracer, allowing gunners to observe their fire and make corrections. The psychological impact of seeing those tracer streams was noted in German pilot reports, though until now nobody had understood that every visible tracer represented 5 additional rounds, invisible but equally deadly, traveling the same path. Dr. Brandt's metallurgical analysis of the Browning's components revealed manufacturing techniques that German industry couldn't match, not because of technological limitations, but because of fundamental differences in production philosophy. The Americans designed their weapons for mass production from the beginning. Every component was made to precise specifications, but those specifications allowed for interchangeability. Any Browning barrel would fit any Browning receiver. Any bolt assembly would work in any gun. This meant that weapons could be assembled by semi-skilled workers on production lines, repaired in the field by replacing standardized components, and manufactured in enormous quantities without sacrificing quality. German weapons were often superior in individual craftsmanship, but each weapon was slightly unique. An MG 131 barrel might need hand-fitting to a specific receiver. Bolts were often matched to individual guns. This made German weapons excellent for small-scale production by skilled craftsmen, but impossible to mass-produce at American scales. The Americans had inverted the equation. Instead of making each weapon perfect through individual craftsmanship, they made the manufacturing process perfect so that every weapon emerged identical and excellent. The Browning M2 was not the best aircraft machine gun because of superior design genius, though the design was brilliant. It was the best because American industry could produce thousands of them, all functionally identical, all of them as precisely made as the most carefully crafted German weapon. And they could do this month after month, year after year, in quantities that overwhelmed any possible defense. Major Vollmer examined the feed system with particular interest. German aircraft guns often suffered from ammunition feeding problems, especially during high-G maneuvers, when centrifugal forces could disrupt the ammunition belt. The Browning used a dual feed system where rounds were positively controlled throughout the feeding cycle. The belt links were ingeniously simple, stamped metal pieces that held rounds securely but released them smoothly when required. The entire feed mechanism was designed with generous clearances and positive mechanical control, meaning it would function reliably under enormous stress, in any attitude, in extreme temperatures, after thousands of rounds. Vollmer test-fired the captured Browning continuously for extended periods, something German guns couldn't sustain without overheating. The Browning fired 500 rounds without stoppage, the barrel glowing cherry red but the action continuing to cycle smoothly. German guns would have required barrel changes or cooling periods long before reaching such round counts. The barrel itself was a revelation. Chrome-lined for corrosion resistance and extended life, it was manufactured to tolerances that seemed impossible for mass production. Yet, the maintenance manual indicated that these barrels were considered expendable items, to be replaced after a certain number of rounds, rather than carefully maintained and reused. This throwaway approach offended German engineering sensibility but made brutal economic sense. Why spend hours reconditioning a barrel when you could simply install a new one in minutes and throw the old one away? Only a nation with massive industrial overcapacity could afford such an approach, and that realization was perhaps more frightening than the weapon itself. The optical sighting systems used with the Brownings also revealed American advantages. The standard American reflector sight, variants of the 9-gun sight, were simpler and more rugged than German designs. They didn't attempt to provide complex ballistic solutions. Instead, they gave the gunner a clear aiming reference and relied on the weapon's high rate of fire and the gunner's training to ensure hits. German sights were often more sophisticated in theory, but more fragile and complex in practice. The American approach was again about simplicity and reliability, characteristics that proved far more valuable in combat than theoretical sophistication. As the testing continued over several weeks, a picture emerged that was deeply troubling to German military leadership. The Browning 50 caliber was not just a good weapon, it represented a different philosophy of warfare. The Germans built excellent individual weapons operated by highly trained specialists. The Americans built good weapons in overwhelming quantities operated by adequately trained personnel who could be replaced. The German approach worked brilliantly when you had industrial capacity, resources, and time to train specialists. The American approach worked when you needed to equip millions of soldiers and airmen quickly, with weapons that would function reliably in the hands of personnel with limited training. By 1942, Germany no longer had the luxury of time, resources, or industrial capacity to compete on American terms. Every month, more B-17s arrived in England. Every month, more 50 caliber Brownings entered service. Every month, the volume of fire that German fighter pilots had to penetrate to reach the bombers increased. And now the testing at Rechlin had proven that the one tactic that seemed to offer a solution, the head-on attack, was actually the most dangerous approach possible. Oberst Lang's report landed on the desk of General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland in early November 1942. Galland, who commanded all German fighter forces, read it with growing alarm. He immediately ordered additional testing and verification, hoping that Lang's conclusions were somehow flawed. They were not. A second team reached identical conclusions. The mathematics were inescapable. Head-on attacks against American heavy bombers were suicide. The problem was that most German fighter units were already employing head-on tactics as their primary attack method. Changing tactics force-wide would require new training, new procedures, and time that Germany didn't have. Moreover, the alternative attack angles, from the sides or rear, exposed fighters to defensive fire from multiple gun positions for extended periods. The B-17 was designed specifically to defend against these approaches, with overlapping fields of fire that made any attack dangerous. Galland faced an impossible choice: continue with head-on attacks and accept catastrophic pilot losses, or switch to alternative attacks and accept lower success rates and longer exposure to defensive fire. In the end, the decision was made by the pilots themselves. Word of the Rechlin tests spread quickly through fighter units despite official secrecy. Pilots who had survived head-on attacks and watched squadron mates die began refusing to execute such attacks. Squadron commanders, faced with mutiny or adaptation, began developing alternative tactics. The official warning, when it finally came, simply acknowledged what frontline units had already figured out through bitter experience. The radio message went out on December 4, 1942, transmitted in clear to ensure all units received it immediately. All fighter units engaged with American heavy bomber formations. Tactical bulletin urgent. Recent ballistics testing of captured American 50 caliber weapons systems indicates extreme danger from head-on attack profiles. Effective immediately, head-on attacks against B-17 and B-24 formations are prohibited except in emergency circumstances. Alternative attack angles must be employed. Unit commanders will develop appropriate tactics. Acknowledge receipt. Galland, General der Jagdflieger. For pilots who had lost friends to those nose guns, the message was a bitter vindication. For German military leadership, it was another in a growing series of uncomfortable revelations about American capabilities. And in the workshops at Rechlin, engineers continued studying the captured Browning, searching for weaknesses that didn't exist, hoping for solutions that couldn't be found. The truth was simple and devastating. The Americans had built a better weapon system. They could produce it in overwhelming quantities, and German pilots would have to find ways to survive against it. The comfortable assumptions about American industrial inferiority had been destroyed as thoroughly as that test mock-up, shattered by the brutal mathematics of modern warfare. The winter of 1942 brought a bitter cold to German fighter bases across occupied Europe, but the chill that settled over Luftwaffe pilot-ready rooms had nothing to do with the weather. Major Wilhelm Herget stood before the assembled pilots of his squadron at Wiesbaden, holding a typed bulletin that had arrived that morning. The men before him, veterans of campaigns over Poland, France, Britain, and Russia, sat in unusual silence. They knew something significant had happened. Herget cleared his throat and read the official tactical directive prohibiting head-on attacks against American heavy bombers. When he finished, the room remained quiet for a long moment before Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, who had already claimed 14 victories, spoke up. So, the command finally admits what we already knew. The Americans aren't the soft targets we were promised. Another pilot, Hauptmann Joseph Wormheller, added grimly, "I lost my wingman last week on a head-on pass. I watched his aircraft simply disintegrate. No explosion, no fire, just pieces falling from the sky. I thought he had collided with debris. Now I understand he flew through a wall of 50 caliber fire that tore his Moes fighter apart." The psychological impact of the directive rippled through fighter units across Germany. For 2 years, Luftwaffe pilots had been told they were flying superior aircraft operated by superior men following superior tactics. Now headquarters was admitting that their primary attack method was fundamentally flawed. If they had been wrong about this, what else might be wrong? At Rechlin, the captured Brownings had been installed in a special test range where German pilots could observe their effect firsthand. Oberst Lang had insisted on this demonstration, believing that pilots needed to see with their own eyes what they were facing. Groups of pilots were rotated through the facility, watching as the Brownings fired at targets representing fighter aircraft at various ranges and angles. The demonstrations were conducted with clinical precision, but their impact was profound and deeply personal. Lieutenant Heinz Noack, who would survive the war with 33 victories, attended one such demonstration in December 1942. He later wrote in his diary about the experience, describing how the test officers first showed them a standard German aircraft machine gun firing at a target fighter mock-up. The 7.92mm rounds made small holes, certainly dangerous but survivable with luck. Then the Browning fired. Noack wrote that the sound alone was different, a deeper, more authoritative hammering that spoke of massive power. The target mock-up, identical to the one used for the German gun demonstration, was shredded. Large sections of aluminum skin were torn away. Internal structure was visible through gaping holes. The engine block, mounted in the mock-up for realism, had multiple penetrations that would have caused immediate failure. Most sobering was the cockpit area, where the test dummy had been struck multiple times by rounds and fragments. The damage was catastrophic and unsurvivable. The demonstration continued with the Browning firing at various angles, showing how the rounds behaved against different aspects of fighter construction. Against wing structures, the 50 caliber rounds didn't just penetrate, they demolished. Wing spars that would require multiple hits from German guns to fail were severed by single 50 caliber rounds. Control surfaces were torn away. Fuel tanks, even self-sealing models, were ruptured so severely that sealing compounds couldn't possibly contain the damage. Then came the most dramatic demonstration. A captured Hurricane fighter, damaged beyond repair and donated by the Luftwaffe technical branch, was positioned in the range. The test crew had repaired it enough to make it representative of an operational aircraft. They had installed full fuel tanks, filled lines with hydraulic fluid, and even placed instrumented dummies in the cockpit. The Browning fired a burst of 50 rounds at the Hurricane from 1,000 yards, simulating a head-on engagement. The effect was devastating and immediate. Multiple rounds struck the engine, which began streaming coolant and oil. The propeller was struck and bent, the cockpit canopy shattered. The dummies registered hits that would have been immediately fatal. Smoke began rising from the engine compartment, and within 30 seconds flames were visible. The test crew extinguished the fire, but the point had been made. A brief burst from a single Browning had effectively destroyed an operational fighter aircraft. Now imagine, Oberst Lang told the assembled pilots, imagine flying toward not one but 4 or 5 of these weapons, all firing at you simultaneously. Imagine doing this while trying to aim your own weapons, while flying at maximum speed, while knowing you have perhaps 3 seconds before you pass through the bomber's position. Calculate your chances of survival. The mathematics are not favorable. The silence that followed was profound. These were experienced combat pilots, men who had faced death many times, and accepted it as part of their profession. But there was a difference between accepting risk and accepting mathematical certainty of death. Head-on attacks against properly armed bombers fell into the latter category. The question became, if not head-on, then how? The B-17 Flying Fortress had been designed specifically to defend against the most common fighter attack patterns. Its name was not mere propaganda. The aircraft bristled with defensive armament positioned to create overlapping fields of fire covering virtually every approach angle. Attack from the rear, and you faced the tail gunner's twin 50s, the waist guns, and potentially the ball turret. Attack from below, and the ball turret had an excellent field of fire. Attack from above, and the top turret could track you throughout your pass. Attack from the sides and multiple gun positions could engage simultaneously. The bomber's designers had thought through every likely attack vector and positioned weapons to counter it. What made this particularly challenging was that bombers flew in formation specifically to multiply their defensive firepower. A combat box formation of 18 B-17s didn't just have 180 50 caliber machine guns. It had those guns positioned so that attacking fighters would face fire from multiple bombers simultaneously. The formations were designed so that any fighter penetrating the formation would spend maximum time under fire from maximum guns. It was a defensive system that turned quantity into quality, using massed firepower to create zones that fighters couldn't survive passing through. German fighter tacticians began developing new approaches that attempted to exploit the few weaknesses in this defensive system. The most promising was the beam attack, approaching from directly abreast the bomber at the same altitude but offset by several hundred yards, then turning sharply to fire while passing through the bomber's flight path at a 90-degree angle. This attack offered several advantages. First, it presented a crossing shot rather than a head-on approach, meaning the fighter wasn't flying directly into the stream of fire. Second, it exposed the bomber's wing root area and fuselage side, where fuel tanks and critical systems were located. Third, the crossing angle meant that even if the fighter pilot's aim was slightly off, the relative motion might carry his rounds into the target. But beam attacks had serious disadvantages. The exposure time was longer than head-on passes, giving defensive gunners more time to track and fire. The deflection shooting required was extremely difficult, demanding precise timing and excellent marksmanship. Most critically, the approach path brought fighters through the defensive fire of multiple bombers in the formation. A fighter attacking one bomber from the beam was exposed to fire from that bomber and potentially 3 or 4 others in the formation. The mathematics of survival were only marginally better than head-on attacks. Another approach was the high-side attack, diving from above and behind at a steep angle, firing during the dive, and continuing through in a high-speed escape. This offered the advantage of gravity-assisting acceleration and made the fighter a difficult target due to its speed and angular motion. But it required perfect timing and precision. Attack too early and your rounds would fall behind the bomber. Attack too late and you'd be in range of defensive guns for extended periods. Moreover, the top turret gunner had an excellent field of fire against diving attacks and could track fighters throughout much of their approach. Some pilots developed ultra-long-range attacks, firing from 1,000 to 1,500 yards, well beyond the effective range of defensive guns, but also beyond the range where their own guns were accurate. The theory was that even a small percentage of hits at extreme range was preferable to high-probability death at close range. These attacks were largely ineffective, with hit percentages below 5%, but they allowed pilots to report aggressive action while minimizing risk. The Luftwaffe High Command found this approach unacceptable, issuing directives demanding close-range attacks with positive results, but such directives couldn't overcome the basic human survival instinct. The twin-engine destroyer concept, heavily armed and armoured Bf-110 and Me-410 aircraft carrying heavy cannon, offered another approach. These aircraft could theoretically stand off at long range and use their heavy armament to destroy bombers without closing to within 50 caliber range. In practice, the destroyers were so sluggish and vulnerable that American escort fighters, when present, slaughtered them. Even without escorts, the destroyers often couldn't catch the bombers, and when they did achieve firing position, their low rate of fire meant they scored few kills relative to the number of destroyers committed. The brutal truth was that there was no good solution to the B-17 problem. Every attack angle had severe disadvantages. Every tactic had been countered by the bomber's design or the formation's defensive firepower. The Browning 50 caliber was so effective at such ranges that fighters had to either accept enormous risks or achieve so little that their attacks were meaningless. This realization spread through fighter units during late 1942 and early 1943. Creating a crisis of confidence that German leadership struggled to address. General Adolf Galland, facing increasing pressure from higher command to stop the American daylight bombing campaign, found himself in an impossible position. His pilots were telling him that attacks were suicidal. The test data from Rechlin confirmed their reports. But Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, insisted that the problem was pilot cowardice rather than tactical reality. At a heated meeting in Berlin in January 1943, Göring accused fighter pilots of exaggerating the danger to excuse their failures. Galland, normally diplomatic, lost his composure. He had brought photographs from the Rechlin tests, showing the destroyed mock-ups and the damaged Hurricane. He spread them across the conference table in front of Göring and said, "Herr Reichsmarschall, this is not cowardice, this is physics. The American 50 caliber machine gun delivers more kinetic energy than our 13mm guns. They mount 10 to 13 of them on each bomber. They fly in formations that multiply their firepower. Our pilots are not afraid, they are being mathematically eliminated. If you doubt this, I invite you to fly a fighter against a B-17 yourself and see how long you survive." The room fell silent. No one spoke to Göring in such terms. But Galland had brought his formal resignation letter with him, prepared to be relieved of command, rather than continue watching his pilots die while leadership denied reality. After a long moment, Göring looked at the photographs and said quietly, "Show me the alternative. Give me tactics that will work." Galland's response was brutally honest. "Herr Reichsmarschall, there are no tactics that will work consistently. The Americans have built a bomber that can defend itself, and they fly them in formations that multiply that defense. Our fighters can attack, and some will get through, and some bombers will be destroyed, but our loss rates will be unsustainable. The only solution is to prevent the bombers from reaching their targets by destroying them on the ground or attacking them when they are most vulnerable, during takeoff and landing. But that requires attacking England itself, which we cannot do." Göring stared at him for a long moment, then dismissed the meeting without further comment. But word of the exchange spread quickly through the Luftwaffe hierarchy, and for the first time, senior leadership began acknowledging privately what pilots had known for months. The American bombers were a problem without a good solution. Meanwhile, American intelligence was beginning to realize that their 50 caliber armament was having an even greater effect than anticipated. Analysis of gun camera footage and bomber crew reports showed that German fighters were increasingly refusing to press home attacks. Pilots would make firing passes from extreme range, outside the 50 caliber's effective envelope, then break away. Or they would position for attacks, but abort when defensive fire became intense. The psychological effect of the massed 50 calibers was proving as important as their actual destructive capability. Major General Ira Eker, commanding the 8th Air Force, noted in a report to Washington that German fighter opposition was becoming less aggressive despite increasing numbers. His intelligence officers suggested that the Luftwaffe was suffering from declining pilot quality as experienced aviators were killed or injured. But after-action interrogations of captured German pilots revealed a different story. The pilots were experienced and skilled, but they had learned that attacking American heavy bombers was extraordinarily dangerous. They were developing a healthy, survival-oriented respect for the fortress's defensive firepower, particularly those nose guns. One captured Luftwaffe pilot, Oberleutnant Hans Ehlers, who had been shot down by escort fighters after aborting an attack on a bomber formation, explained his thinking to interrogators. "I have flown against the British, against the Russians, against everyone. I am not a coward. But to fly directly toward the Americans, to point my aircraft at their guns, this is not bravery, this is stupidity. I have seen what their 50 caliber guns do to fighters. I have watched friends die. If I am to die, let it be in combat with a chance of victory, not in a mathematical certainty of death." His perspective was shared by increasing numbers of German fighter pilots, creating a tactical environment where the psychological impact of American defensive firepower was reducing German effectiveness even when bombers flew without escort. The Rechlin testing facility continued examining the captured Brownings throughout 1943, searching for any weakness that could be exploited. Engineers tested ammunition to determine if there were variations in quality that could be used to predict malfunctions. They found that American ammunition was extraordinarily consistent, with quality control that exceeded German standards. They examined firing mechanisms to find maintenance vulnerabilities that could be exploited. They discovered that the Browning was so robustly designed that it would continue functioning even with significant neglect, something German guns wouldn't tolerate. They analysed the cooling system to determine how quickly the guns would overheat. They found that the air-cooled barrels could sustain longer firing sequences than German guns before requiring cool-down periods. Every test, every analysis, every examination revealed the same fundamental truth. The Browning .50 caliber was an exceptionally well-designed weapon, manufactured to high standards, and employed in overwhelming quantities. There was no magic vulnerability to exploit, no secret weakness to attack. The Americans had simply built a better system and produced it in numbers that German industry couldn't match. Dr. Werner Brandt, who had led much of the technical analysis, wrote in his final report a conclusion that was carefully worded but devastating in its implications. The American .50 caliber weapon system represents the successful application of mass production techniques to precision armament manufacture. The weapon is not individually superior to German designs in any single characteristic. However, its combination of adequate performance in all characteristics, exceptional reliability, and ease of mass production results in an overall system effectiveness that German weapons cannot match. The strategic implications are significant. American industrial capacity permits the deployment of these weapons in quantities that overwhelm tactical countermeasures. German fighter tactics must be redesigned to minimize exposure to concentrated .50 caliber fire. No modification to current German fighter designs will provide adequate protection against multiple .50 caliber hits at combat ranges. The report's recommendations were stark. Avoid head-on attacks entirely. Minimize time spent in .50 caliber range. Accept lower hit probabilities from extreme range attacks rather than higher casualties from close-range attacks. Focus on developing weapons that can destroy bombers from beyond .50 caliber effective range. And critically, accept that current German fighter tactics and weapons are inadequate against American bomber formations. By the spring of 1943, the tactical reality had crystallized into a bitter truth that German fighter pilots understood, even if higher leadership wouldn't acknowledge it. The B-17 Flying Fortress, armed with its 10 to 13 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, flying in mutually supporting combat box formations, was the most formidable defensive weapons system ever deployed in aerial warfare. Attacking them was dangerous from any angle. Attacking them head-on, flying directly into the concentrated fire of those nose guns, was mathematical suicide. The testing at Rechlin had proven what pilots had learned through bitter experience. The Americans had built not just a better gun, but an entire weapons system that integrated superior design, mass production, and tactical employment into something that German pilots couldn't effectively counter. The radio message that went out in December 1942, warning against head-on attacks, represented more than a tactical adjustment. It was an admission that German assumptions about American industrial and technical capability had been catastrophically wrong. Every fighter pilot who received that message understood its deeper meaning. The war was changing. The comfortable certainties that had sustained them through years of victory were crumbling. The Americans were not the soft, technically inferior opponent that propaganda had portrayed. They were a formidable enemy with weapons systems that German pilots had to respect or die fighting. And as winter gave way to spring, and the American bombing campaign intensified, that lesson would be reinforced again and again in the skies over occupied Europe. The Browning .50 caliber had changed the mathematics of aerial combat, and German fighter tactics would never be the same. The spring of 1943 brought longer days and clearer skies over Europe, perfect weather for bombing operations. American B-17 formations began penetrating deeper into German territory, and Luftwaffe fighter pilots who had hoped the winter might bring respite found themselves facing an intensifying campaign. The tactical directives prohibiting head-on attacks were now being tested under the harsh conditions of actual combat, and what worked in theory often failed when faced with the reality of hundreds of bombers protected by thousands of .50 caliber machine guns. Hauptmann Egon Meyer, commanding officer of the 3rd Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader II, was not a man who accepted defeat easily. He had studied the Rechlin reports, understood the mathematics that made head-on attacks suicidal, but refused to believe there was no solution. If frontal attacks were death sentences when executed individually, perhaps they could work if executed differently. His innovation would become one of the most significant tactical developments of the bomber war, though it would ultimately prove only a temporary solution to an overwhelming problem. Mayer's concept was brutally simple. If a single fighter, attacking head-on, faced mathematical certainty of destruction from concentrated fire, perhaps a formation of fighters attacking simultaneously from multiple angles could overwhelm the bomber's defensive capacity. He called it the Sturmgruppe approach, though it would evolve into various forms throughout 1943. The theory was that if 6 to 8 fighters attacked a single bomber from slightly different angles all at the same instant, the defensive gunners couldn't possibly engage all threats simultaneously. Some fighters would be shot down, but others would get through and destroy the bomber. It was a tactic born of desperation, trading certain losses for possible victories. The first test of Mayer's formation attack came on March 2, 1943, against a formation of B-17s returning from a raid on Ham. Mayer assembled 8 fighters from his Gruppe and briefed them carefully. They would approach from ahead and slightly above, spread across a front of approximately 1,000 yards. At his signal, all would dive simultaneously toward a single bomber in the lead element. Each pilot would fire at the maximum range of his weapons and continue firing until he either destroyed the bomber or had to break away to avoid collision. No one would break early. No one would hesitate. They would attack as a coordinated unit or die as individuals. The attack went exactly as Mayer had planned, which meant it was simultaneously successful and catastrophic. The 8 fighters dove together, presenting the bomber's gunners with multiple targets appearing at different angles within seconds of each other. The nose gunner engaged the center aircraft in the formation. The top turret swung toward another threat. The cheek guns picked targets, but there were too many attackers appearing too quickly. 3 fighters made it through the defensive fire, and their concentrated cannon and machine gunfire tore the bomber apart. One wing folded upward, the fuselage broke in half, and the aircraft fell from the sky in pieces. It was a spectacular kill. But the cost was devastating. Of the 8 attacking fighters, 3 were destroyed. 1 pilot was killed when his aircraft exploded under .50 caliber fire. Another was mortally wounded, and his aircraft crashed attempting to return to base. The third bailed out successfully, but with severe injuries. 2 more fighters were damaged so badly they barely made it home and were written off as total losses. For the destruction of 1 bomber, Mayer's Gruppe had effectively lost 5 fighters and 3 pilots. The mathematics were only marginally better than individual head-on attacks. But Mayer was nothing if not analytical. He studied the gun camera footage and survivor reports, looking for ways to improve the tactic. The fighters that survived were those that had approached from angles where the bomber's defensive fire was weakest or blocked by the aircraft's structure. The fighters that died had flown through the heaviest concentration of fire. With this understanding, he refined the tactic. Subsequent attacks would focus on approaches that minimized exposure to nose guns, while still achieving the shock effect of simultaneous arrival. The tactics evolved throughout the spring and summer of 1943, becoming increasingly sophisticated and marginally less suicidal. But they all shared a common characteristic. They required German pilots to accept significant casualties in exchange for destroying bombers. This was a trade-off that mathematically favored the Americans. Germany was losing experienced pilots faster than they could train replacements, while American bomber production was accelerating. Every week brought more B-17s to England. Every month brought more combat-ready crews. The .50 caliber Brownings that had so impressed the engineers at Rechlin were now arriving by the thousands, each, one representing another gun that German fighters would have to face. By mid-1943, a single B-17 carried 13 .50 calibers. A combat box of 54 bombers carried over 700 guns. The volume of fire was so intense that pilots described flying through formations as like flying through a steel curtain, with tracers so thick they seemed solid. Oberleutnant Franz Stiegler, who would survive the war and later befriend an American bomber pilot in an extraordinary story of mercy and honor, described his experience attacking bomber formations in the summer of 1943. Every attack was a negotiation with death. You would position your aircraft, calculate angles and speeds, watch the bombers growing larger in your windscreen. Your mind would be doing mathematics automatically, computing closure rates and firing solutions. But underneath the professional calculations was a primitive animal awareness that you were flying toward weapons designed to kill you. The tracers would start when you were still far away, bright streams reaching out like fingers trying to grab you from the sky. You'd see them arcing toward you, each visible tracer representing 5 rounds you couldn't see. And you knew that somewhere in that storm of metal was the round with your name on it. The question was whether your attack would succeed before that round found you. Some days you would press the attack and survive. Other days you'd see a comrade's fighter simply disintegrate, torn apart by multiple hits. The randomness was almost worse than certainty. At least with certainty, you could prepare yourself mentally. But the randomness meant every attack might be your last, and there was no way to predict or prepare. The psychological toll of this operational environment was immense. German fighter pilots in 1943 were experiencing stress levels that would later be recognized as indicators of severe combat trauma. They were flying multiple missions per day, watching friends die regularly, and knowing that every mission might be their last. Medical officers began reporting increasing cases of what they termed Frontschau, combat fatigue, though the condition was more accurately described as rational response to impossible circumstances. Lieutenant Heinz Noack, whose diary would become one of the most valuable first-hand accounts of the German fighter pilot experience, wrote extensively about the psychological impact of attacking American bomber formations. His entries from the summer of 1943 reveal a man struggling to reconcile his duty with the mathematical reality of his survival odds. In one entry from July, he described attacking a formation of B-17s near Hanover. He had positioned his flight of 4 fighters for a beam attack, approaching from the side in a coordinated pass. As they closed to firing range, the defensive fire intensified to levels he had never experienced. Tracers filled the air so thickly that he instinctively flinched, causing his aim to suffer. His wingman's aircraft was hit multiple times and fell away trailing smoke. Noack pressed his attack, fired his cannon, saw strikes on the bomber's wing, but the aircraft remained in formation. As he passed through the bomber stream, he felt impacts on his own aircraft. 2 .50 caliber rounds had punched through his left wing, missing fuel tanks by inches. Another had struck his fuselage just behind the cockpit, passing through non-critical areas but serving as a violent reminder of how close death had come. He landed with his aircraft damaged, his wingman dead, and no confirmed bomber destruction to show for it. That evening, he wrote in his diary about the mathematical certainty that he would eventually be killed if the current operational tempo continued. It was not defeatism or cowardice, simply statistical reality. Every mission exposed him to weapons capable of destroying his fighter with single hits. Every attack put him in range of dozens of such weapons. The odds were clear. The American side of this equation was experiencing its own evolution. Bomber crews, while grateful for their defensive armament, were paying a terrible price for every mission deep into Germany. Even with the protection of massed .50 caliber fire, German fighters were getting through. Bombers were being destroyed. Crews were dying. The .50 caliber Brownings were excellent weapons, but they weren't invincible shields. They were tools that had to be employed correctly by trained gunners under the most stressful conditions imaginable. Gunnery training in the United States had been expanded dramatically in response to combat reports. Gunners now received extensive practice on moving targets, deflection shooting, and managing their weapons during high-stress situations. But no amount of training could fully prepare a 19-year-old waist gunner for the reality of German fighters attacking through heavy flak, with pieces of other bombers falling past his position, while his aircraft shuddered from battle damage. Technical Sergeant Michael Rostovich, a ball turret gunner on a B-17 named Lucky 13, kept a personal log of his missions that provided remarkable insight into the gunner's perspective. His aircraft had survived 22 missions by August 1943, an achievement that put them well above average survival rates. Rostovich credited their success partly to luck, partly to an excellent crew, but largely to aggressive defensive gunnery. His philosophy, shared by many experienced gunners, was to open fire at maximum range, even beyond effective range, to force attacking fighters to take evasive action or break off their attacks early. The psychological effect of heavy defensive fire, he argued, was as important as actual hits. In one mission log entry from August 19, 1943, during a raid on Schweinfurt, Rostovich described an attack by 6 German fighters approaching in a coordinated formation. The fighters came from ahead and slightly high, spreading across the formation's front. Rostovich, in his ball turret beneath the aircraft, had limited ability to engage frontal attacks, but he watched the nose gunner and top turret open fire at extreme range. The tracers reached out toward the fighters, falling short initially but walking closer as range decreased. One fighter broke away early, apparently unwilling to press through the fire. The others continued their attack, and Rostovich felt the aircraft shudder as cannon shells struck the left wing. The nose gunner scored hits on one attacker, which rolled inverted and fell away streaming smoke. The top turret engaged another, its fire joined by guns from adjacent bombers in the formation. That fighter exploded spectacularly, pieces scattering across the sky. The remaining attackers fired their weapons and broke away, having damaged Lucky 13 but not fatally. As Rostovich rotated his turret to engage fighters attacking from other angles, he had a moment to reflect on what he'd witnessed. 6 fighters had attacked. 1 had broken off under defensive fire without engaging. 1 had been destroyed. 1 damaged. 3 had gotten through and fired but hadn't achieved a kill. From the gunner's perspective, the defensive system had worked. From the German fighter pilot perspective, 50% losses for no bombers destroyed was unsustainable. Both perspectives were correct, which illustrated the fundamental problem facing the Luftwaffe in mid-1943. The arms race between German tactics and American defenses continued throughout the summer. German pilots developed attacks from the vertical, diving from directly above where bomber turrets had difficulty tracking. American bombers began flying tighter formations so that top turrets could provide mutual support. German pilots tried attacks from the sun, using the glare to mask their approach. American formations began positioning specific aircraft to watch sunside approaches and call out attackers early. German pilots experimented with extremely long-range rocket attacks, hoping to destroy bombers before entering 50 caliber range. The rockets proved wildly inaccurate and rarely achieved hits. Every innovation was countered. Every tactic was adapted. And underlying all of it was the fundamental reality that the Browning 50 caliber machine gun created a lethal envelope around each bomber that German fighters had to penetrate to achieve kills. The testing at Rechlin in late 1942 had established the weapon's characteristics. Now, 9 months later, those characteristics were being demonstrated daily in combat. The gun's effective range of 1,000 yards meant fighters had to close to that distance or closer to ensure hits with their own weapons. The gun's rate of fire meant that in the time it took a fighter to close from 1,000 yards to point-blank range, a single Browning could fire approximately 60 rounds. Multiple guns could fire hundreds of rounds into the space a fighter would occupy. The gun's kinetic energy meant that even a single hit could be catastrophic. Multiple hits guaranteed destruction. Major Wilhelm Herget, now commanding an entire Gruppe, held a remarkable briefing in September 1943 that was preserved in unit records. He had assembled his squadron commanders and most experienced pilots to discuss tactics going forward. The transcript of his briefing provides insight into how German fighter leadership was thinking at this critical point in the war. "Gentlemen," he began, "we must acknowledge certain realities. First, the Americans will continue their daylight bombing campaign. Second, they will continue flying in formations that provide mutual defensive support. Third, each bomber carries weapons that can destroy our fighters with single hits. Fourth, we cannot avoid attacking these formations. Our orders require it. Our nation requires it. Given these realities, we must accept that losses are inevitable. The question is not whether we will suffer casualties, but whether those casualties will be exchanged for sufficient bomber destructions to make the campaign unsustainable for the Americans. Currently, We are not achieving favorable exchange ratios. We are losing experienced pilots faster than they can be replaced. The Americans are losing bombers but replacing them faster than we can destroy them. This situation is mathematically unsustainable. We will lose this war of attrition unless something changes." He paused, letting the grim mathematics sink in, then continued, "What must change is our approach. We must stop thinking of bomber attacks as individual fighter actions. We must attack as coordinated groups focusing overwhelming force on single bombers. Yes, we will lose fighters in such attacks, but if we destroy more bombers than we lose fighters, and if each bomber carries 10 men while each fighter carries 1, the mathematics begin to favor us. This is not pleasant arithmetic, but it is necessary arithmetic. The doctrine that emerged from such thinking was the concentrated group attack, where entire squadrons of 20 to 30 fighters would mass for a single coordinated attack on a bomber formation. The goal was to saturate the defensive fire capability, accepting that some fighters would be shot down, but ensuring that others got through to destroy bombers. These mass attacks became increasingly common in late 1943, and they were devastating for both sides. German fighters would assemble at altitude, position themselves along the bomber route, and dive in mass toward the formation. The volume of fire from both sides was so intense that pilots described it as flying through a thunderstorm of metal. Aircraft on both sides would be streaming smoke, falling from the sky, or exploding. Individual acts of skill or courage mattered less than being in the right place at the right moment or the wrong place at the wrong moment. The randomness was terrifying. A pilot could execute a perfect attack and be killed by a chance round. Another could make mistakes and survive untouched. The concentrated attacks achieved better results than previous tactics, destroying more bombers per sortie, but the loss rates among attacking fighters remained catastrophically high. In one particularly brutal engagement over Bremen in October 1943, a group of 32 fighters attacked a formation of 50 bombers. The attack destroyed 6 bombers, damaged a dozen more, but cost 13 fighters destroyed and 6 damaged beyond repair. The exchange ratio by aircraft was roughly 2-1 in Germany's favour, but by personnel it was 2-1 in America's favour. Each lost bomber meant 10 casualties, each lost fighter meant 1, and critically, Germany was losing pilots it couldn't replace, while America was losing aircraft it could replace almost immediately. By the autumn of 1943, the situation had clarified into stark terms. The Browning 50 caliber machine gun, deployed in overwhelming numbers on American heavy bombers, had created a defensive system that German fighters could penetrate only at catastrophic cost. The testing at Rechlin had shown why this was true, revealing the weapon's devastating kinetic energy, reliability, and range. 9 months of combat had proven that the test results were, if anything, conservative. In actual combat conditions, with multiple guns firing from multiple bombers in formation, the defensive firepower was even more formidable than laboratory testing had suggested. The radio message that had gone out in December 1942, warning against head-on attacks, had been correct in its specific tactical guidance, but had understated the broader strategic problem. The issue wasn't just that head-on attacks were suicidal. The deeper issue was that attacks from any angle against formations of B-17s armed with massed 50 caliber guns were extraordinarily dangerous, and no tactical innovation could change the fundamental mathematics. German pilots had developed tremendous respect for the Browning 50 caliber, a respect born from bitter experience and validated by technical testing. They understood that they were facing a weapon system that represented American industrial and engineering capability at its finest. The gun was not just a piece of hardware, but a symbol of the wider war, a conflict where American capacity to produce excellent equipment in overwhelming quantities was beginning to overcome German advantages in experience and tactical innovation. The lessons learned from the captured Brownings tested at Rechlin had spread throughout the Luftwaffe, changing tactics, doctrine, and strategic planning. But those lessons could not change the fundamental reality that Germany lacked the industrial capacity to match American production or the pilot training capacity to sustain the loss rates imposed by attacking heavily defended bomber formations. As winter approached again, bringing another year of war closer to its end. German fighter pilots understood with increasing clarity that they were fighting a losing battle. The courage and skill that had brought victory in earlier years were no longer sufficient against an enemy with better weapons in greater numbers operated by increasingly competent crews. The shock that Oberst Lang had felt when he first saw the captured Browning in October 1942 had been replaced by grim acceptance. The Americans had built a better weapon system and deployed it in such numbers that German countermeasures were inadequate. The mathematical certainty of this conclusion was as undeniable as the ballistics data from the Rechlin tests. In the final analysis, the story of the Luftwaffe testing captured 50 caliber Brownings and then radioing warnings against head-on attacks was not simply a tactical anecdote. It was a microcosm of the entire air war over Europe, illustrating how American industrial power and engineering excellence, combined with sound tactical doctrine, created weapons systems that German pilots could not effectively counter. The Browning 50 caliber machine gun changed the mathematics of aerial combat, and those new equations predicted German defeat with the certainty of physics. The pilots who received that radio warning in December 1942 were among the first to understand this truth, though it would take another 2 years of bitter combat for the final mathematical proof to be written in the skies over a defeated Germany. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.